December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It is a quiet Sunday morning, and soldiers stationed here are just beginning to rise. The streets of nearby Honolulu are quiet. Soon, however, the quiet will be shattered by an event that will change the very course of history, as well as the lives of countless millions of people the world over. The name Pearl Harbor will become virtually synonymous with the concept of the surprise attack. In the immediate aftermath, and for decades to come, the facts surrounding the attack and the events that led to it will be discussed and debated, fingers pointed, blame assigned. Today, few believe the American government should have and could have been completely surprised by it. For both America and Japan, the road to Pearl Harbor was long, but straight. And the date that will live in infamy was almost 100 years in the dawning.
Many American-owned ships have been sunk on the high seas. One American destroyer was attacked on September 4th. Another destroyer was attacked and hit on October 17th. 11 brave and loyal men of our Navy were killed by the Nazis. Today, in the face of this newest and greatest challenge of them all, we Americans have cleared our decks.
We figured that they'd go to war with Germany first, and most guys thought that they would declare war on Germany to help England, since they were helping England so much. The guys in the Atlantic was already at war with Germany. The destroyers, it was convoying these supply ships to England. I mean, they were fighting an undeclared war in the North Atlantic up there with the German U-boats. And they just thought about Japan over there. They was tied up with China and wasn't a whole lot going on there, and nobody dreamed that they'd ever attack the United States, or at least the ones I knew didn't.
The planes and submarines that attacked the United States Pacific Fleet at the Pearl Harbor Naval Base in Hawaii on the morning of December 7th, 1941, were, in a very real sense, launched 88 years earlier, when in 1853, 4 American warships under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry dropped anchor in the fortified harbor of Uraga. Perry demanded that he be allowed to deliver a message from President Fillmore to the ruling shogunate. Although he was granted an audience, he was unable to convince the Japanese to open their ports to U.S. ships. He returned the following year, this time with 7 ships, and repeated his demands. Faced with Perry's persistent diplomacy and a clear display of naval superiority, the shoguns had no choice but to yield. At the time, Japan was a world unto itself, having isolated itself from political, commercial, and religious influence from beyond its shores for more than 2 centuries. Now, the barriers had been irrevocably breached. Just 3 years later, American Consul Townsend Harris was escorted into the audience room of what is now the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, then known as Edo, to begin negotiations that would lead to a full-fledged trade agreement between the U.S. and Japan. Ironically, the date of Harris's arrival was December 7th, 1857. The effect of this sudden change on Japan was enormous. Due in large part to their inability to maintain Japan's policy of isolation, the shogunate was overthrown within a decade, and the emperor was returned to power. However, what seemed like capitulation to the Western world was, in fact, altogether different, and beyond the scope of the Westerners' understanding. In opening herself to other cultures, Japan was actually preparing to dominate them. Even before the fall of the shoguns, Japanese leadership began to plot maneuvers that would place them in a position of power both in Asia and the world. As one Japanese counselor put it, the nations of the world will come to look up to our emperor as the great ruler of all nations, and they will come to follow our policy and submit to our judgment. This was, in fact, a restatement of the policy of Hakko Ichiyu, articulated 1,200 years earlier by Emperor Jimmu. Bring all the corners of the world under one imperial roof. Simply put, rule the world.
Well, I was called up to the exec's office right after the attack and things slowed down. We had about, if I recall, 5 or 6 bodies up there lined up. Now, bear in mind, I was regular Navy. I wasn't a draftee. I was in over a year before the draft ever started. And I looked at these fellows, and this one guy, his name was Leach, a quartermaster, who I thought was Leach. I looked at him. I had known Leach. He was on the quarterdeck. I've crossed the quarterdeck 3 or 4 times a day. It was just close to our shop. I saw no visible signs of injury on him, no place, but I looked at him, I identified him as Leach, the quartermaster. And the next day, Leach came aboard. He was one of them was blown over the side. A lot of them dove over the side when the executive ordered to abandon ship because we were going down. So what the bomb had did to some of these people was just hard to describe, because on this one guy, I've known him for at least a couple of years, and I described him, and it wasn't him at all.
The early 20th century found the United States in a race with the rest of the world for influence in the Pacific. America, England, Russia, France, Holland, and Japan all vied for territorial holdings in the region. Having wrested the Philippines and Guam from Spain, the U.S. also controlled Midway, Samoa, and the Hawaiian Islands. In addition, all of these nations were competing for power in China. In 1900, the Boxer Rebellion led to the killing of missionaries, diplomats, and other foreigners living in China, and opened the door for other nations to send in an expeditionary force of 19,000 soldiers. In the treaty that resulted, Britain was the clear winner. And although it would maintain a military presence, the U.S. had clearly lost influence in China. This fact, coupled with having her resources in the Pacific consumed at an unexpected rate trying to put down an independence movement in the Philippines, induced the U.S. to order all its territories in the Pacific closed to foreign investment. The Japanese, in particular, took offense to this move, but said nothing. In 1905, Japan had become the first Asian power in modern times to defeat a European power in armed conflict when it defeated Russia at Port Arthur. This, coupled with the 1894 defeat of China in a battle for influence in Korea, made it clear that the Japanese were the preeminent power in Asia. To achieve all this, after existing for centuries as a closed feudal society, had taken Japan fewer than 50 years. She was now a thoroughly modern nation, but she had achieved her success by following an ancient code. In her two great military victories, Japan had made good use of an old martial principle of the samurai. Win first, fight later.
This is an officer of the Imperial Japanese Army. He is one of the best educated savages in the world. Tough and tenacious, fanatical, smart. He believes in his emperor beyond all things. He will die for him. But what makes him a formidable enemy is something else. It's training. Some of the most rugged all-around physical training on Earth. These pictures are from a confiscated Japanese motion picture made 5 years before Pearl Harbor. The picture shows how officers who are now fighting us were trained at Japan's West Point, Shikwan Gakko. To this Tokyo school every year come the cream of Japanese youth, about 2,000 students. Each has received training from the day he first walked. At the age of 14, the toughest and healthiest are selected. The survivors take special exams. Perhaps 59 flunk, 1 passes. He goes on to a junior military academy, and after 2 summers, he moves to the final phase. The first day at Japan's West Point. The CO is welcoming them. "We congratulate you," he says. "We will train your body and your mind. You will work 17 hours a day, 7 days a week. Nothing must distract you from your mission. Remember the words of your first emperor. We shall spread ourselves all over the world. We shall make the whole world our dominion." For men with a destiny, day begins at the break of dawn. Later in the day, there are more practical exercises. The Japanese can't get enough. They make each jump like they're landing on the face of an American. Jiu-jitsu, their most ballyhooed item. They think it's unbeatable. It isn't. In 10 big matches against American wrestlers, jiu-jitsu experts were flattened like pancakes. But the favorite exercise is bending their backs each morning to Hirohito's holy palace. It develops the spine. In the classroom, there is absolutely no instruction in international relations nor economics. Yet the men who are graduated helped rule Japan. Their lack of knowledge about other countries, about the qualities of other people, about production, causes them to take wild gambles. But on other subjects, they are very thorough. Trigonometry, chemistry, history. There's a great emphasis on languages. German, as an Axis partner. English, they once hoped to use it in California. And Russian. A favorite cultural pastime is kendo. Being pounded on the head is supposed to make a man alert. There are other outdoor studies. Signal practice, surveying. And this class in yelling, to prepare a man for giving commands and to try scaring the hell out of the enemy. Eventually, every Japanese officer candidate must specialize. Many go into cavalry school. Others go into the armored forces. The engineers, whose instructors have spent years rigging bridges in China. A popular course at Japan's West Point is the artillery. But the most glamorous branch of them all is the Imperial Air Forces. Bombardiers have their own private workout over a moving map. Later it was Chungking. Pilots get into the air very early in their training. Later, these men will prepare to die for their emperor in Zeros and Nakajima bombers. All officer candidates are taken on a tactical tour This jaunt is to a historic battlefield in Manchuria. The instructor tells his men that here their grandfathers, 40 years before, smashed the Russians and vaulted Japan into the big leagues. Holy ground for the Japs, because here was a bloody stepping stone on the divine mission to world conquest.
Well, an evening was seemed like another war, because as the night drew by, you weren't allowed to light any matches, and all the vehicles had all their lights painted down to size of a pea hole, where the light came through, they can see, let somebody know that they're coming. And there was a lot of sporadic shooting going on that evening, and we couldn't figure out why or where it was coming from or what's happening. But the next morning when we got up, we found out that the soldiers that went on duty, patrolling and so forth, we found out that there was a lot of animals killed, mules, horses, dogs, because anything that moved that night, when you hollered halt, who goes there? And something moved and you didn't say nothing, you were dead.
When World War I broke out in Europe in 1914, Japan's decades-old treaty with England compelled her to join the fight on the side of the Triple Entente. Japan took the German colony of Kiao Chau in the Chinese province of Shantung. Then, in quick succession, the Mariana, Marshall, and Caroline Islands. Japanese warships cruised the Pacific looking for German ships, but never engaged any. All the while, Japan worked to consolidate her territorial gains, signing secret agreements with all the major powers except the United States. The surrender of Germany restored peace to the world, but the treaty did little more than set the stage for future conflict. The Treaty of Versailles, which the United States refused to sign, allowed Japan to keep almost all her possessions. The United States, on the other hand, had steered for itself a course of isolationism, on which it would remain for 20 years. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, Japan continued to chip away at the Chinese province of Manchuria. Open war between the two nations finally came in 1936. For 5 years, China's appeals to the United States fell on isolationist ears.
America tests the mightiest bomber ever built. $3.5 million worth of fighting plane takes to the skies. With its 8,000 horsepower and wingspread of 210 feet, the B-19 passes with colors flying, a symbol of air supremacy to come. Merchantmen, destroyers, battleships, cruisers slip down the ways as part of the huge program for a two-ocean navy. 690 ships have been ordered. Among these, the USS North Carolina, mightiest battleship afloat, America's grim challenge to marauders of the sea. Its salvos roar, beware! At night, its guns blaze in spectacular majesty.
On December 12, 1937, the gunboat USS Panay was cruising the Yangtze River, providing a protective shield for U.S. citizens and diplomats living in the region. At 1:38 in the afternoon, under clear skies, just hours after having been stopped, boarded, and released by a Japanese motor launch, the Panay was attacked by Japanese bombers. At the time of the attack, the Panay had a pair of 250-square-foot American flags draped over its awnings. The bombing and strafing continued for 20 minutes during which time Panay took 12 direct hits and sank. When it was over, 3 sailors were dead, 45 were wounded.
It is a matter of common knowledge that Japan's policy is fundamentally inspired by a genuine desire to guarantee peace in the Far East and to contribute to the maintenance of peace throughout the world.
Despite evidence to the contrary, the Japanese government declared the attack a mistake. Outraged, President Roosevelt demanded that there be a serious reprisal for the action. But the isolationist tendencies of Americans proved too strong, and the Congress did not act.
Well, I've always thought that, and when we go into the schools and talk to the school kids, we always stress the fact that the Japanese made 4 mistakes. The first one is they didn't bomb the Navy Yard. And immediately we had Navy Yard workmen come in that night, start putting these ships back together. They didn't bomb the submarine base. And our submarines sank 90% of the shipping that was sunk in the Pacific. They didn't bomb the oil storage tanks. That left us an unlimited supply of fuel, and they didn't bomb the powerhouse. So we had an unlimited supply of power to operate the machinery in the Navy Yard. And really, the only damage they did, they sunk a bunch of obsolete battleships. They didn't get any of our carriers because none of our carriers was in port. And if they'd have sunk any of those carriers, the war might have lasted a whole lot longer.
The day following the sinking of the Panay, Japanese troops attacked the Chinese city of Nanking. Once in the city, Japanese commanders let their troops run wild through the streets. In what would become known as the Rape of Nanking, over the next several weeks, they systematically looted and burned the city and surrounding towns, destroying more than 1/3 of the buildings. Japanese soldiers raped, tortured, and murdered the citizens of the city. In the end, more than 40,000 Chinese were killed. Following the Nanking massacre, the U.S. government placed a so-called moral embargo on shipments of scrap iron and steel to Japan. By 1940, the Japanese government had set itself on a course that seemed certain to lead to war with the United States. The conquest of Manchuria was complete, and a puppet government installed, which took its orders from Tokyo. Chinese citizens were forced into slave labor in support of the Japanese advance into the rest of China. In addition, in an effort to secure the natural resources it needed to fuel its aggression, it had seized control of a number of Pacific islands, and the spoils of these conquests began to make their way to factories in Japan. Still, they needed more. Despite their successes, the offensive in China had stalled with little progress being made since 1938. With Hitler and Mussolini firmly in control of the European continent, an alliance with these sworn enemies of Britain and America seemed only natural. In September 1940, Japan, Germany, and Italy signed the Tripartite Pact. The windfall of this agreement was that it cleared the way for an invasion of another source of natural resources, French Indochina.
Somewhere in the Atlantic, Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill meets President Roosevelt. A hand clasp that ushers in one of the most dramatic conferences between the leaders of nations ever recorded. Here, the next day, the Atlantic Charter with its 8 points is formulated. As they part, hopes for a permanent peace rise in the hearts of the two great democracies of the world. $16 million man-days lost by strikes that slacken America's mighty defense effort. Throughout the nation, the wrath of the mob vents itself on non-sympathizers who attempt to pass mass picket lines. At widely scattered localities, police clash with strikers in hand-to-hand conflict. Tear gas bombs burst before the American aviation plant at Inglewood, California, as United States troops arrive to take over the factory and preserve order. They move in to assure uninterrupted production of vitally essential aircraft for America and its friendly nations at war.
With the Nazi-controlled Vichy government ruling over France and all of its territories, the Japanese demanded permission to station troops in Indochina. Ostensibly, these forces were to assure that there were no military goods passing over the border into China. At first, the Vichy French resisted, but soon gave way. Once these units were in place, movement to and occupation of the South was inevitable. In July 1941, Japanese forces, operating under the thin veil of a French-Japanese Mutual Defense Pact, entered South Indochina. The United States government was incensed and alarmed by this action. It clearly indicated a change of direction for Japanese aggression. If they could not advance north into China, they would move south toward Allied possessions, including the Philippines. President Roosevelt, already stoking the fires for a war with Germany, sought some form of retribution. The immovable, isolationist views of the American public held fast, though, and military action was out of the question. Still, it was clear that Japan's aggression could not go unanswered, so the United States froze all Japanese assets in the U.S. This was a blow to the economically strapped empire, but the news got worse. In addition to freezing the assets, the United States placed an embargo on the shipment of oil to Japan. Britain and the Netherlands followed suit. Despite the fact that Japan had stockpiled oil in anticipation of an embargo, they had only enough to last 18 months, and military leaders estimated the war in China would take 3 years to conclude. Clearly, the situation was becoming critical. Japan's government, angry with what it saw as unjustified interference in its own regional affair, viewed the oil embargo as an act of war. Among the Japanese high command, it was now taken as a matter of fact that if the situation with the United States could not be settled with diplomacy, it would have to be settled with military action. Tensions escalated rapidly.
Our captain, Kazan Young, he was on the quarterdeck just above where I was at. When the Arizona blew up, he was blown over the side. He swam back to the gangplank, or swam back to the ladder and climbed the ladder. The executive had given orders to abandon ship because we were going down and the Arizona was pulling us down. There was just no way that we could battle any longer. But when he swam back aboard ship and back to the ship and climbed the ladder, he gave orders to beach the ship and got us underway, got a tug alongside, got us underway, and got us in shallow water before we went down. For that act, Captain Kazan Young was one of the 3 live people to get the Congressional Medal of Honor Now, if I recall correctly, and you can check on this, there was 14 people in Pearl Harbor got the Congressional Medal of Honor. 11 of them were killed there. Captain Kazan Young was one of the 3 live people to stand up and receive the Congressional Medal of Honor on board our ship a month or 2 later. I forget just what month it was now. Then he transferred to the USS San Francisco and was killed the following November when the shell hit off the bridge off of Savo Island. Killed him and all his staff except one man, a commander McCandless, who brought the ship in. So he got to wear his medal for about 11 months, I guess.
Throughout the next few months of 1941, U.S. and Japanese diplomats negotiated in earnest. Japan asked the United States to lift the oil embargo, which the United States refused to do unless Japan agreed to halt its aggression against China. The United States regarded Japan's adamant refusal to budge on their stance as a sign of hostility. Like the Japanese leaders, Roosevelt and others came to realize that war with Japan was inevitable. Accordingly, the U.S. began fortifying the bases in the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur began to organize his ground forces in the Philippines into a formidable army. His confidence in his troops grew daily, as did his determination to meet any Japanese attack head-on. As the diplomats continued to talk, both nations were preparing for war. By this time, the United States Pacific Fleet, which usually operated out of California, had already been in Pearl Harbor for more than a year. Hawaii was seen as the perfect location for the American forces in the Pacific because of its location, halfway between the United States West Coast and the Japanese military bases in the Marshall Islands. This forward presence posed a formidable threat to the Japanese. If Japan was to continue its expansion, the fleet at Pearl Harbor would have to be dealt with. In February, the mighty U.S. Pacific Fleet got a new commander, Admiral Husband E. Kimmel. He had many characteristics in common with Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese fleet, although he lacked Yamamoto's charisma and creative imagination. Kimmel graduated from Annapolis in 1904, the same year Yamamoto graduated from Etajima. Kimmel revealed a remarkable talent for gunnery, and many of his early assignments were connected with that field. In May 1925, Kimmel was selected to attend the Naval War College. Soon after graduation, he was promoted and sent to the Navy Department in the Policy and Liaison Division. After 3 years there, he returned to sea in command of a destroyer squadron. His next command was captain of the battleship New York, which was followed by an assignment back in Washington as the Navy's budget officer. In 1938, he returned to sea in command of a cruiser division with the rank of Rear Admiral. Within a year, he stepped up to commander, cruiser battle forces. This stainless career involved no experience with naval aviation. In February 1941, he assumed command of the U.S. Pacific Fleet with the rank of full admiral. Kimmel was devoted to the offensive. He never visualized his fleet as taking a defensive posture. Throughout 1941, he worked himself and everyone else to the verge of exhaustion to prepare for the day all knew was coming, when his ships would sail forth to engage the enemy. After the debacle at Pearl Harbor, ironically enough, the U.S. Pacific Fleet ships and men were generally conceded to have never been in better fighting trim than under Kimmel's leadership. Events pushed Kimmel into command of the fleet a year earlier than planned. His predecessor, Admiral James Richardson, was fired after opposing the White House on disposition and training of the fleet. He was canned after only 1 year, but not before he had established 2 dangerous precedents. He put the fleet on an operating schedule so fixed that its movements were readily predictable, and he considered torpedo nets around the ships an unnecessary precaution. General Walter Short, Army commander in Hawaii, was atypical for a general officer. He was not a West Point graduate. Since receiving a direct commission in 1902, he had served in posts from the Philippines to Alaska and was with Pershing in Mexico. He was competent and conscientious, but oddly enough, although George Marshall had spelled out to Short in unmistakable terms that the Hawaiian Department's primary duty was to protect the fleet in Hawaii, Short looked upon the fleet as protection for the island and believed that the Japanese would attack, if at all, only when the fleet was well out to sea. This mistaken attitude left the U.S. Air Forces sitting on the runway wingtip to wingtip on that fateful morning.
With the stroke of a pen, President Roosevelt sets in motion the nation's machinery for drafting all men between the ages of 21 and 35. October 16th, on this day, millions of American youth in every corner of the nation register for military service. History repeats itself. A World War drama is reenacted. The same fishbowl from which capsules were drawn for the wartime draft of 1917 again serves for the country's first peacetime call. Millions for artillery. Millions for tanks and anti-tank guns. Millions for airplanes, thousands of them, while American plants are turning out other thousands for Britain. American Army airmen were the first to experiment with parachutes for war, years before Russia and Germany made use of them in actual conflict. As Japan casts its lot with the Axis powers, the United States speeds the building of its first 2 ocean navies.
By October of 1941, the Japanese had concluded that they would have to go to war with the United States. As diplomatic negotiations continued, Yamamoto was instituting a plan to immobilize the U.S. fleet with a surprise attack. Despite some opposition by the General Staff, soon extensive training exercises were underway. Yamamoto's bold plan called for the use of 6 heavy aircraft carriers carrying 300 planes and accompanied by 24 supporting vessels, as well as a fleet of submarines. The primary targets of the attack were to be the American aircraft carriers. Intelligence indicated that although groups of ships regularly left the port to engage in exercises, most of the time the entire fleet was docked in the harbor. All available modes of bombing were to be used in the attack, and the attack force had to be equipped to refuel the attack aircraft at sea. In order to assure success, all U.S. aircraft would have to be destroyed to prevent aerial opposition. Furthermore, a strong fighter element would be included in the attack as air cover for the Japanese carriers. Finally, the attack would be most effective if it could be carried out in daylight. Yamamoto preferred sunrise. With training completed, the carrier task force, under the command of Chuichi Nagumo, left Japan under a veil of radio silence. U.S. intelligence followed its movements for a time, but lost track before its destination could be determined. The die had been cast. On December 5th, 1941, General Douglas MacArthur, who had continued his preparations for an attack on the Philippines, said, "Nothing would please me better than if they would give me 3 months and then attack here." He was to get neither wish.
I can recall the faces of those fellows, and I can recall, not in recent years, but I have had dreams in the past, and I could look in the eye when I tell you this, where airplanes would be flying over in huge numbers, and you're running, you're out in the open, and you're running, you're trying to find cover, and you jump off a cliff. I've done this in my dreams, and you're going down and down and down. That's when you wake up. That has been an experience of in my dreams, and I'm sure this is not new to fellows who are in the service. I'm sure that many of them could tell you more hairier experiences than I could ever begin to tell you, and I understand that. But I'm sure that their stories in reference to something like this would be like mine. They have relived their experiences many times, yes. Well, I'm going to tell you something, and you'll find hard to believe, and I'll put my hand on the Bible if you want me to. I dreamt, prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, one night I saw ships turning over, I saw guys diving over the side, and I saw smoke. Now you say, well, what brought that on? We were having air raid drills on Sunday. We were having them Sunday night instead of Sunday morning. Me thinking about those possibilities, I attributed that dream to that particular incident. But I did have a dream, and I will put my hand on a Bible. I will take a polygraph test if you ask me to convince you that I'm telling you the truth. But I dreamt what happened in Pearl Harbor prior to the time that it happened.
In April 1940, Roosevelt had ordered the United States Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor. This was the perfect location for the American forces in the Pacific, halfway between the United States West Coast and the Japanese military bases in the Marshall Islands. To the Japanese, this fleet posed a formidable threat to their ambitions in the Pacific. To combat this threat, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese fleet, devised a plan that was worthy of his poker player reputation. To open the war, he ordered 3 major attacks and several minor ones on American and British forces in the Pacific. The first, by a number of hours, was Pearl Harbor. The objective was to cripple the only force in the Pacific that could interfere with the other 2 attacks on the Philippines and Malaya. Surprise was essential in the Pearl Harbor attack. This was so not just because the attack itself was unexpected, putting the defender at a disadvantage, but also attacking a major naval base with carrier aircraft in broad daylight had never been done before, and no one was sure how successful it would be. On paper, it appeared it would work. Colonel Billy Mitchell, father of the American Air Corps, proved that. During his fight with the U.S. Navy, he persuaded the Army to allow him to demonstrate the capabilities of air power against naval targets. He was given the captured German capital ship, the Ostfriesland, and told to try to sink this unsinkable ship. Mitchell's squadron was successful at destroying the Ostfriesland and several other ships in later tests. But by proving that surface fleets were obsolete, he also sank his own career. The British had also proven this point rather successfully in a nighttime air raid on the Italian fleet in Taranto Harbor on November 11th and 12th, 1940, a raid that crippled Axis naval power in the Mediterranean Sea. The experienced and history-savvy officers of the Japanese fleet knew that the first time anything is tried, particularly something risky, the unexpected can be expected. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's force would include 6 heavy aircraft carriers carrying 300 planes, accompanied by 24 supporting vessels and a fleet of submarines. In the spring of 1941, Admiral Yamamoto began mapping out his Pearl attack plan and showing it to other Japanese officials. The basic concept was to injure American military power in the Pacific to such an extent that Japan would be able to overrun a vast territory, and then the United States would ultimately decide on a negotiated peace rather than a protracted war. Japan could not grab this territory in the Pacific if a large enemy fleet was in the same waters at the same time. America had the only other large fleet, and most of it was based at Pearl Harbor. Cripple that fleet, and Japan could take whatever it wanted in the Pacific.
They called it the paradise of the Pacific, but it really wasn't. There wasn't a whole lot to do for servicemen there. They had boxing teams on the ship, and we had rowing where we'd take rowing whaleboats out and have competition with the fleet, and basketball and football and baseball. But Liberty and Honolulu wasn't too good. I mean, there just wasn't a whole lot to do. I couldn't even go in and get a beer because I was too young. Couldn't buy no beer. You couldn't go to Waikiki Beach in uniform. So a lot of guys had locker over at the YMCA where they changed into dungaree pants and those Hawaiian shirts, and then you could go out there, but you couldn't go out there in uniform. And a lot of movie stars were out there, but I didn't go out there too much. Once, a couple of times.
The Pearl Harbor Strike Force, 6 carriers with 300 aircraft, 2 fast battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines, supported by 8 tankers and supply ships, was concentrated in great secrecy at a secure anchorage in the Kuril Islands, north of Japan. As part of the undertaking, another group of submarines was assigned to ferry 2-man midget subs, tasked with penetrating Pearl Harbor from the sea at the time the airmen attacked. The primary targets of the attack were to be the American aircraft carriers. All U.S. aircraft were to be destroyed to prevent aerial opposition. A strong fighter element would be included in the attack for air cover for the fleet. The attack force would be equipped to refuel the attack aircraft at sea. The attack would be most effective if it could be carried out in daylight. Yamamoto preferred sunrise. There was opposition to Yamamoto's plan among Japan's Navy general staff, but it was soon overcome, and the green light was given to proceed with preparations for the attack. All of the necessary training was given to troops, and all of the fighters and submarines were prepared. Although American and Allied intelligence services were aware that war was imminent, the much less secretive concentration of Japanese forces for an offensive southward into the southern resources area, which included Malaya, the East Indies, the Philippines, and others, attracted their attention. War warnings to Pacific Theater commanders only confirmed their expectations that something would happen in that quarter. In the fall of 1941, the naval and air base at Pearl Harbor and the installations on Oahu represented the greatest concentration of American military power in the world. This force was under the command of Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, an officer with a stainless career, who was given the command unexpectedly when his predecessor, Admiral James O. Richardson, had incurred the wrath of President Roosevelt. In normal circumstances, the island was the home to 9 or 10 battleships, 3 carriers with over 259 aircraft, a score or more of cruisers, and dozens of odd destroyers, submarines, and support ships, plus about 500 land-based aircraft and 2 understrength infantry divisions. General Walter Short, Army commander in Hawaii, dismissed the possibility of a carrier air raid on the place, despite the fact that the Navy had for years practiced such a bold stroke against the Panama Canal, San Diego, and Pearl Harbor itself. These practice raids had demonstrated that such operations were not at all difficult. Despite that, Short's principal concern seems to have been the threat of sabotage by members of Hawaii's large resident Japanese and Japanese-American population. On November 26, 1941, the strike force sailed under the command of Nagumo. Maintaining total radio silence, the strike force took a route through the North Pacific, which had proven wholly devoid of shipping under normal circumstances. They sailed on, waiting for the coded order to launch the strike. Climb Mount Niitaka.
I was fascinated by the sights I saw there. Unsophisticated teenager, just turned 18, battleships all over the place with big guns sticking up. I was at cruisers and submarines, and over in this other place where I was supposed to be were the PBYs. Well, they called us to muster on the steps of the administration building. And the bosun mate counted out 4 or 5 at a time and marched them off. And there was one man left standing. And he says, "You must be Messner." "Yes, sir." He says, "Well, kid," he says, "the squadron's all full up." "My goodness," I says, "what about me?" He says, "Well, somebody will flunk out. We'll get a chance to pull you up. In the meantime, we're going to put you on temporary duty aboard the Avocet." I said, "What's that?" He says, "That's a seaplane tender." I says, "Where is it?" He says, "Well, it's out to sea right now. You'll be coming in tomorrow." I kind of figured I was let down. I was betrayed. I wanted to be on one of them big fighting ships or an airplane, battleships with the big guns sticking up all over them. I said, here they put me on a tugboat. But I was mistaken. The Avocet turned out to be a very brave ship. When the battleships eventually were sitting on the bottom, burning and exploding and capsizing, they called upon the Avocet to go alongside and put the fires out. They were like dinosaurs trapped in the tar pits. And the Abbot went amongst them while the bombs and torpedoes were slamming into them. And we poured water on them. We pulled people out of the water. We did all kinds of things. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself.
At 6 a.m. on December 7, 1941, the first Japanese attack wave launched from a point 275 miles northeast of Pearl Harbor. The first wave of the strike force consisted of 49 high-level bombers, 40 torpedo bombers, and 51 dive bombers, escorted by 51 fighters. As these flew southward, they split up into different sections, each with its particular objective. At 7:02 a.m., an hour after they had taken off from their carrier decks, 2 Army operators at the Opana radar station on Oahu's north shore picked up the approaching Japanese fighters on radar. Although U.S. Army enlisted personnel manning an experimental radar system spotted the incoming aircraft, the duty officer at Air Defense Headquarters dismissed the bogey, suggesting that it was a flight of B-17s due from the mainland. At about the same time, a destroyer, the Ward, exercising outside the harbor entrance, spotted a submarine periscope and made a vigorous attack. The Ward had killed one of 5 midget subs trying to break into the harbor. No one took the destroyer skipper's frantic messages seriously. The first Japanese bomb was dropped at 7:55 a.m. on Wheeler Field, 8 miles from Pearl Harbor.
That morning at 7:55, my friend and I, Steve Seaback, were going to attend church services. As we're approaching the church, we heard a hum of planes behind us. We looked back, and over a mountain pass, which is known as the Koli Pass, we saw planes coming over. As we looked back, we noticed that there was a rising sun on the wingtips. So when I saw that, my legs locked. I got a chill through my body, and I thought to myself, forget about ever going home. But anyway, as they came overhead, they came so low that you can see their ugly, silly grins on their faces looking down on us. As they made a couple turns, they went towards the quadrangles. There was different quadrangles, the 3rd Engineers, the 19th, the 27th, the 35th. Each regiment had their own quadrangles. As they went over the quadrangles, we can hear a scraping going on. And as they went over the 3rd Engineer quadrangle, they dropped a bomb on the building, and we understand at the time that 2 soldiers were killed. When they were finished strafing around Schofield, they went on their way to Wheeler Field. From there, we can hear the explosions, smoke bellowing up into the sky, and it made your heart feel sad knowing that these people were being killed, not knowing what's happening to them, and you just had to stand there and just have tears coming out of you. At the same time, our weapons were locked in racks, and they were in the weapons room, and we were unable to get to them, and the weapons sergeant was nowhere to be found, so there was nothing we could do. But in the meantime, we noticed that after the bombing and strafing stopped at Wheeler Field, we noticed that the planes were going further out, which meant that they went to Hickam Field and to Pearl Harbor to do more havoc out that way.
As the planes reached Pearl, the American crews were on the decks of their ships for morning colors and the playing of the Star-Spangled Banner. The Japanese planes moved with stunning precision to their primary targets, the 7 battleships moored at Battleship Row along the southeast shore of Ford Island. The first torpedoes hit Oklahoma with a crump and a boom, and the battleship shuddered like a wounded beast. The next torpedoes struck almost immediately after the first. Within 20 minutes of the first attack, the big ship began to roll over. She kept rolling until her superstructure hit the mud about 25 feet underneath.
Like I say, there were a lot of targets up there, and the pointers and trainers were training the gun manually, trying to get on these targets, and the gun captain was calling the side angles, deflections, and the fuse settings. And there were several planes shot down, but there was so much concentrated fire over the harbor after they realized what was going on that you couldn't tell who was getting what planes or nothing. There was just a black barrage up there, these shells exploding. But unfortunately, the fuses weren't set on a lot of those shells, and they ended up in Honolulu. And they thought the Japanese were bombing Honolulu, but they didn't drop a bomb in Honolulu. That was our own 5-inch shells that they didn't. They had a 45-second time fuse on them. And normally, the gun directors would give you the side angles and deflections and the fuse settings, but our gun directors were off the ship. They were over in the yards for being overhauled. So this was all done manually. And I don't know, we may have fired some that didn't have the fuse set on them in the excitement and everything, but we had 3 fuse pots on the side of the gun, and the shells were supposed to be put in the fuse pot and cranked in, and that would start setting the fuses on there, and it would change constantly as the plane was coming in when we had our gun directors. But like I say, we had to do everything manually.
Most of the time during general quarters, battle stations, in the Navy, you go down and in somewhere. You go down in the engine room, you go in the fire room, you go in the magazine, you go in the turrets on the big ships. My battle station was not down and in, up and out. I was up on the starboard side, right outside the captain's cabin, bringing these shells up, having them spin the fuse and jump, put them in the gun and jump out of the way. So I got to see everything that happened. I had a 280 arc of vision. I was up high on the gun deck, and right in front of my eyes, I watched the unthinkable take place. I watched a gigantic battleship Oklahoma, the first of the tandems, roll over slowly and finally capsize belly up. There were men in there, trapped, and they couldn't get out. Then they ordered us out of there, and we had to go alongside, bow in against the battleship West Virginia. We had to go around the capsized Oklahoma, along with 2 tugboats. We were pouring water on the battleship West Virginia. She had taken 6 torpedoes and 2 armor-piercing shells. They were using shells which normally were fired from the big guns of their battleships, put fins on them, went through armor plate on the decks of the battleship and exploded several decks down and ripped it open from the inside. And they slammed the torpedoes until suddenly she was going on had a port list and settled on the bottom. That's the West Virginia. The 2 inboard battleships were protected by the outboard, Oklahoma and West Virginia. So the Maryland and Tennessee took bomb hits, but they didn't get sunk.
Standing in a window of the Ford Island Command Center, Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey grasped the situation at once. Racing to the center's radio room, he ordered an alert to be broadcast in plain English. Air raid, Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. Forward of the overturned Oklahoma, the California was punctured by 2 torpedoes. Oil spewed from her sides like blood. But her guns opened fire and kept firing throughout the raid as the California settled into the mud. Aft of the Oklahoma, the West Virginia began to sink with her decks afire, her guns also keeping up the barrage. One of the garbage lighters swung alongside to help fight her fires. Finally, the harbor waters put out the flames, but she also sank into the mud. Approximately 10 minutes into the attack came the most thunderous explosion as a bomb smashed through the 2 armored decks of the USS Arizona and ignited her powder magazine. The big battle wagon seemed almost to lurch out of the water. The concussion was felt for hundreds of yards around her. The resulting explosion ripped open the hull of the ship and started a fire that swarmed over the ship, completely engulfing her. Within minutes, she sank to the bottom of the harbor. More than 1,100 men went down with the Arizona. At 8:05, after 2 torpedo hits, the target ship Utah strained against her mooring lines with a 30-degree list. With her torpedo blister removed, the Utah had little chance of surviving the attack. She capsized at 8:10. In the meantime, startled citizens of Honolulu looked upward, wondering what was causing the noise and smoke. Many needed some time to realize that this was not just another drill. Soon, American anti-aircraft shells began tumbling into downtown Honolulu. The explosion and resulting fires caused a number of civilian casualties.
One that sticks in my mind, we heard the Arizona, the explosion on the Arizona. And of course, we had to look behind us at the battleships because we were on the port side and our starboard side was facing where the battleships was at. And the planes came right down behind the Navy Yard and they were strafing everything, the torpedo planes heading for the battleships. But the first we saw the explosion, naturally you would look around and it looked like the whole row of battleships blew up. And but it was the Arizona, and then the Oklahoma was rolling over just about the same time. It was turning all completely over. And our gun captain was a boatswain's mate second, and he'd been in the Navy 16 years. And those guys, they just couldn't believe it. Because I remember him, he had tears streaming down his face and saying, wait till our planes get in the air. But unfortunately, they never did get in the air because they had that attack synchronized where they knocked out all the airfields and they had all these planes bunched up together on the runway trying to keep them from being sabotaged. And they were just sitting ducks for these Jap fighters come down through there strafing them.
We were a repair ship, and we had various ships come alongside, spend a few days alongside of us. On the morning of the attack, we were tied up to the USS Arizona. I'm one deck down in the shop, reading the Honolulu Gazette, and the right-hand column is talking about the negotiations going on in Washington between Admiral Caruso and Nomura and our Secretary of State, Cordell Hall. Bear in mind, I'm very, very concerned. I'm thinking about these things. It's on the right-hand column, right-hand side. If you get the Honolulu Gazette, December the 7th, 1941, that's where you'll find it, in the right-hand column. As I was reading this column, the boatswain mate passed the word, all hands to quarters. Now, we don't usually have quarters on Sunday morning, never did. I ran to my quarters station. And the reason I ran, because of the urgency in his voice, told me that something was up. As I ran to my quarters station, I went up the ladder and went around the fan tail of the ship next to a 3-50 caliber anti-aircraft gun. Tracer shells skipped off the deck both to my left and to my right. Now bear in mind, between tracer shells, there has to be a row of shells you don't see. So when the tracer shells skipped across the deck on both sides of me, I heard something go, I glanced up, saw the plane peel off, the red ball and right wing. I then knew the boatswain mate had passed the wrong word. He meant general quarters, not quarters where you fall in and receive the orders of the day. So my general quarters station, I had to duck and dodge. I was on the top side next to the Arizona to get to the first hatch and go down in there where I was in the damage control party. As I went down the ladder, as I stepped from the left of the ladder to the right of the ladder, a bomb came down the ladder, came through the hatch, tore the ladder off top of the hatch, and went on down through the ship and exploded in the bottom, blew a hole out the bottom. Now, I found out later, we were told, that that was a 16-inch armor-piercing shell that the Japs were using because we were tied up to the battleships and Battleship Row, and they had to use that type of weaponry in order to penetrate the thick decks on the battleships. So whether ours was an accident or on purpose, I don't know, but anyway, it went through our ship from top to bottom, see. That was an armor-piercing shell. So that was, I measured it off later, and I took 3 steps from where I was to the hole in the deck where I was standing just seconds before. So that was my second close call of that morning. The other bomb hit up forward in the supplier area where the steel was stored and stuff like that. It didn't penetrate the bottom of the ship. However, when the Arizona, we were on fire on our starboard side, and when the Arizona blew up, it put the fires out on our starboard side. So what killed fellows over there saved fellows on our ship. See?
Well, it just looked like total destruction over around Battleship Row because all those ships over there sitting on the bottom, it just, and seeing them the day before when they were all ready for inspection, because they always had inspection on Saturday morning, and why those ships were gleaming. It kept them so clean and everything, and then the next day they're sitting there in total ruin, and we realized we was at war.
At about 8:30 a.m., the first wave of Japanese planes, their ordnance expended, broke off the attack and headed back out to sea. Within minutes, a second strike as strong as the first came over. Hampered by dense smoke from the damage inflicted by the first strike and by the increasingly voluminous anti-aircraft fire, as well as surviving American P-40s, the second strike inflicted relatively little damage. After the first wave of attackers departed, before the arrival of the second wave, the crew of the Nevada, despite the damage done to her, got her underway and moved her down the channel toward the open sea. Before she could clear the harbor, the second wave arrived, which included 170 more bombers and fighters. Seeing the Nevada under steam, they concentrated their initial attacks on her, hoping to sink her in the middle of the channel and block it. On orders from Harbor Control, the Nevada beached herself at Hospital Point. Then, as suddenly as they had come, the attackers vanished. In a little more than an hour and 45 minutes, the Japanese had smashed the pride of the Pacific Fleet and changed naval dictum forever.
I saw a devastating sight. Decapitated bodies from the gun turrets, arms and legs strewn over the deck, blood running out of the scuppers. Men walking down the deck, completely burned with their clothes burned off and their skin hanging down. You heard the old term, dead men walking. Some of them fell over the side. We couldn't get to them. They fell over the side. It was burned into shreds almost. It was a tragic sight to see.
Of the approximately 100 U.S. Navy ships present in the harbor that day, all 8 battleships were damaged. 5 were sunk. 11 smaller ships, including cruisers and destroyers, were also badly damaged. The wounded included 1,178 people. Among those killed were 2,335 servicemen and 68 civilians. The USS Arizona was dealt the worst blow of the attack. A 1,760-pound bomb struck her, exploding the ammunition on board and killing 1,177 servicemen. Even as the second strike flew back to the carriers, a critical argument was going on aboard the Japanese flagship. Impressed by the success of the first strike, air-minded officers were trying to convince Nagumo to undertake a third strike, this time against the harbor installations, warehouse, and fuel dumps. Nagumo demurred, concerned over the location of the missing American carriers, which had not yet been located. As a result, as soon as the second strike had been recovered, their strike force turned back to Japan. No Japanese naval task force would ever again penetrate so far eastward. Pearl Harbor was a devastating defeat for the United States. A total of 18 warships were sunk or damaged, including 2 battleships that were total losses, Arizona and Oklahoma. In addition, nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed. Japanese losses were 5 midget submarines and about 28 aircraft, for a total of less than 50 men. Arguably, the defeat could have been worse. The 3 Pacific Fleet carriers escaped the debacle. Saratoga was undergoing a refit at San Diego, while Lexington and Enterprise were at sea, returning from delivering additional aircraft to Wake Island. A case can be made that Nagumo's decision not to undertake a third strike was an error, for it would have destroyed the fuel dumps, thereby crippling the remnants of the fleet, seriously damaging the harbor facilities, and forcing the U.S. fleet back to the West Coast. But it is important to note that Nagumo's second strike had been relatively ineffective and suffered the greatest losses. A third attack may have meant losing the advantage of surprise, valuable airmen, and, as long as the U.S. carriers remained undetected, even the fleet itself. Sunset did not end the commotion in the skies over Oahu. At 10:10, 6 Wildcats from the U.S. carrier Enterprise, returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island, droned over the harbor. Below them, the sight was one of hell on earth. The Arizona continued to burn, as she would until the 9th. Also aflame was the destroyer Shaw, the battleship California, and many of the military installations and airfields around the island. Just as the 6 pilots lowered their gear and entered the landing pattern for Ford Island, the entire harbor opened up with everything they had. Miraculously, 2 of the planes landed safely, and a third made nearby Barber Point. However, 3 of the Navy aviators were killed by friendly fire, the last fallen warriors of a long day of death.
Back on the West Virginia, sitting on the bottom, water on her decks, then airspaces below, sitting on the bottom. After the West Virginia settled, you could hear banging, kang, kang, kang. Men with wrenches or hammers beating on the metal, trying to let people know they were trapped there. But they were below a section which was full of water, and they were down, way down. If you've ever seen a battleship up close, especially when they're in dry dock, you can't believe how big they are below the waterline. Why, there's several, it must be 6, 8, 10 stories below there. They have a band of armor all around both sides, 18 inches thick. The Japanese torpedoes cracked that open like it was eggshells. And they penetrated the armor plate on the decks and exploded. These brave samurais, warriors, came like thieves in the night without a declaration of war. And they slaughtered my comrades. I never forgave them for what they did. I don't think I ever will.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
In less than 500 carefully considered words, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt told the United States Congress, and indeed most of the nation, what had happened at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, just under 24 hours ago. Before Sunday morning, the men and ships of the United States Navy's mighty Pacific Fleet had slumbered peacefully here, untouched and unthreatened by the war that already was ravaging Europe. Few, if any, in this idyllic island setting had reason to suspect that dawn would bring, at 7:55 a.m., over 300 fighters and bombers of the combined naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. They had come out of the rising sun in 2 meticulously planned and carefully timed waves. In less than 2 hours, they had sunk 5 of the 8 battleships in the harbor and crippled the other 3. They had also badly damaged 11 smaller ships, including cruisers and destroyers. And they had killed 2,403 Americans, including 1,177 who went down with the USS Arizona when she was struck with a 1,700-pound bomb that exploded her powder magazine. They had wounded almost 1,200 more. By all accounts on this morning, the attack had been a complete success. The United States, which had, since the close of the Great War, stubbornly steered a course of non-participation in world affairs, would soon be involved in another world war. But though it was not yet evident in the chaos and carnage of this Sunday morning, the leaders of the force that carried out the attack on Pearl Harbor had made critical errors. Errors for which Japan would be made to pay a heavy price. Japan had spent more than half a century preparing for war with the United States, and she had struck a devastating first blow. But she had stopped short of the coup de grace, and her fate already was sealed.
We were in a bad way there. We had to have a lot of course, I guess it's good when you're young, because if we'd had a whole lot of intelligence, we would probably thought we were going down a tube, because everything was, the Ogallala mine layer was turned over, the Oklahoma was turned over, of course, our ship was sitting on the bottom in shallow water.
As the pilots who carried out the second wave of the attack on Pearl Harbor returned to their carriers, jubilant at the damage they had done and confident in their victory, their commanding officers were engaged in heated discussions over what to do next. From his flagship, the Hiryu, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commander of the 2nd Carrier Division, sent a message to Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the Pearl Harbor Striking Force, that he was ready to launch another attack. The pilots gathered on the flight decks of their carriers and waited for the command to attack again. Admiral Nagumo was questioning Lieutenant Commander Mitsuno Fuchida, who had been chosen by Admiral Yamamoto to lead the airstrike. Yes, Commander Fuchida reported, he believed the battleship force of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was completely immobilized for 6 months. No, he admitted, the American carriers were not at Pearl, as the Japanese High Command had hoped. The 3 carrier task groups were at sea, possibly nearby. Admiral Nagumo had never liked the Pearl Harbor attack plan. With the seas beneath his ships getting choppy and his heart heavy with the fear that one of the American carrier groups might stumble upon them if they stayed long enough to launch a third attack, he ordered his carriers to stow their planes and come about for the return trip to Japan. Nagumo and his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Ryunosake Kusaka, who also had been opposed to the surprise attack, believed that they had accomplished their mission. They had, they believed, prevented the United States from waging war in the Pacific for at least 6 months and assured the safety of the attack forces on their way to attack Malaya and the Philippines. Best of all, they had done this without risking their own carriers. But by not staying to exploit their victory, a mistake which puzzled even the American command, Nagumo and Kusaka left the Americans in better shape than they realized. Their superiors in the Japanese military establishment knew it even before the attack force returned home in apparent triumph. Fortunately for Japan, her naval and air forces were on the move elsewhere in the Pacific. The attack at Pearl Harbor was just the opening salvo in what was a well-planned and devastating 3-pronged attack. For the next 72 hours, the Japanese would unleash their military forces all across the Pacific. On the night of December 7th, Japanese troops landed at Singora in British Malaya, losing only 9 men. Early on December 8th, Japanese planes and warships attacked Davao and Guam. Bombers from the Kwajalein Atoll base in the Marshall Islands, which had been given to Japan by the League of Nations, bombed Wake Island. Japanese Air Force also bombed Singapore and the nearby naval base. Vice Admiral Minichi Koga surrounded the island of Hong Kong with his ships, while planes from Japanese bases in South China bombed it repeatedly. Before overrunning Shanghai, Japanese naval forces sank the HMS Petrel after the crew of the British gunboat refused to surrender, then boarded the USS Wake and imprisoned her crew. The Japanese army in Indochina crossed the border into Thailand and took over the country without a fight by diplomatic accommodation. While the bombs rained down on Hawaii, Navy pilots of Japan's 11th Imperial Air Fleet, based on Formosa, spent a fitful night beside their planes waiting for a heavy fog to lift. Their assignment? To bomb the critically important American airfields 500 miles away in the Philippines. This was part of a coordinated attack on U.S. forces, stretching across the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to Wake Island, Guam, and Manila. At 6 a.m., tension on Formosa was growing thicker than the fog. A loudspeaker blared the news of the attack on Pearl Harbor, sending the Japanese forces into resounding cheers. Now, their mission had acquired an added risk. The Americans would no longer be surprised, and surely be waiting in strength. The fog lifted, and by 10:45, December 8th, Philippine time, 108 Japanese bombers and 84 Zero fighters were airborne and speeding toward Luzon, the largest island in the Philippines. While General Douglas MacArthur is by most historians considered one of the most capable military leaders the U.S. ever produced, an American Caesar, he had his failures. One of the most devastating was the manner in which he conducted the defense of the Philippines. There, despite the fact that MacArthur had more than half a day's warning, the Americans were caught flat-footed. Immediately upon learning of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Major General Louis Brereton, commander of U.S. Air Forces in the Philippines, wanted permission to launch his bombers against the Japanese on Formosa. The Americans did not have adequate maps, and the B-17s would have to go without fighter protection. But Brereton believed that his crews could inflict heavy damage on the Japanese bases. Brereton sent his planes aloft as a precaution and waited for a reply to his request. Hours passed with no reply from MacArthur. Then, shortly after 10, the okay came. Brereton called his planes to land and refuel. It was then, at about 12:20 p.m., while they were lined up in neat rows, that the first bombs dropped. The damage was devastating. The Japanese surprised the majority of the U.S. Far East Air Force on the ground, destroying most of its B-17 bombers and P-40 fighters. Japan's program for conquest in the Pacific had begun with stunning effect. The United States naval and air power in both Hawaii and the Philippines had been dealt a series of terrible blows. On the same day, the vital outposts of Guam and Wake Islands were bombed, and invasion was sure to follow. Guam's end was swift. In the hours after midnight on December 10th, some 5,400 Japanese Marines and infantry splashed ashore. By dawn, they had reached the governor's palace, where a brief firefight took place. As the sun came up, the Americans ceased fire, and the 427 U.S. Marines surrendered. On that ignominious note, the only piece of United States territory in the 3,000-mile stretch of the Western Pacific between Wake and the Philippines, was lost. Wake was next. The first attack on Wake occurred just before noon on Pearl Harbor Day. Upon hearing the attack on Pearl by radio, the island commander had his bugler sound call to arms. The Marines grabbed their rifles, and 4 Grumman Wildcats took off on patrol. Then a squall came up, and the patrolling Wildcats missed a flight of 36 enemy planes that came in under the clouds. The Japanese strafed the airfield on Wake, blowing up 7 of the fighters still on the ground. But with the remaining airborne planes, the Flying Leathernecks managed to shoot down a dozen of the enemy bombers. Shortly after midnight on December 11th, Marine lookouts saw a blinking light on the horizon, and by dawn, a Japanese invasion force was wading ashore. The Marines waited until the last minute to open fire. Their 5-inch guns crippled the Hibari, flagship of the invasion force, and sunk 1 destroyer. A second destroyer was hit and sunk by 100-pound bombs from the surviving Grummans. In a 45-minute battle, a few hundred Marines had beaten back an entire Japanese invasion fleet. The remaining Japanese forces turned tail and sailed back to their base at Kwajalein. The Americans had lost only 1 man. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the Japanese had been turned back. The attack on Wake was one of the most humiliating defeats of the Imperial Navy during the war. But the Japanese would be back in force. The Americans were not the only ones facing Japanese assaults. On December 10th, 84 bombers and torpedo planes, dispatched from a Japanese airbase in Indochina with 1,000-pound bombs, located the new British battleship Prince of Wales and her companion vessel, the battlecruiser Repulse, at sea north of Singapore, and sank both in less than an hour. British naval power in the east was broken. Though they had not delivered the finishing stroke at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had put the Americans and the British on their heels in the Pacific. The Japanese Navy had been at war constantly since 1937, and it was in prime condition for war. The Americans and British would not be ready for months. When they were ready, and set about the task of dislodging the Japanese from all the territories they had claimed in these 72 hours, they would find the going very rough indeed. For his part, Admiral Yamamoto knew within hours of the strike that it had failed to achieve its objective. It was just before 9 in the morning on December 8th, Tokyo time, when he received word that Nagumo had stowed his planes and turned the carriers for home. In his diary, Yamamoto wrote that he had been prepared to lose 2 of his aircraft carriers to achieve total victory at Hawaii. The American carriers, Yamamoto knew, were the real prizes, and Nagumo had not bagged them. Yamamoto knew that modern warfare already had made battleships obsolete, and that the 3 American carrier groups still at large in the Pacific posed a much greater threat than Japan would have had to fear from the great ships now lying in the mud or aflame in Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto, a poet and fanatical bridge player, summarized his feelings with a bit of dark humor in a waka, a classical Japanese poem of 5 lines. What I have achieved is far from a grand slam. Let me in all modesty declare, it is more like a redoubled bid just made. Adolf Hitler received the news of the bombing of Pearl Harbor in his remote underground bunker at the Wolf's Lair, some 450 miles northeast of Berlin. When press officer Heinz Lorenz handed him a cable containing the news, the Fuhrer slapped his thigh and shouted, "The turning point!" Hitler could hardly contain his ebullience when he related the news to Generals Alfred Jodl and Wilhelm Keitel. "Now it is impossible for Germany to lose the war. We now have an ally who has never been vanquished in 3,000 years. Roosevelt must be smashed. It has been the major accomplishment of the Japanese that they have destroyed the myth of American superiority from the start." But Jodl and Keitel, like the other generals in Hitler's command, had misgivings about the news flow. They all had hoped that Japan would enter the war, but in Siberia and against the Russians, to take some pressure off the Wehrmacht on Germany's eastern front. Though General Heinz Guderian's 63rd Corps was entrenched in the suburbs of Moscow, it, like most of Army Group Center, was all but immobilized by the snow and cold. Most of the air support with which the German armies had started the Russian campaign had been transferred to North Africa, where British forces were doing a good job of keeping much-needed supplies from getting through to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrikakorps. In the first hours after the war, Guderian began to move his troops back from Moscow, suffering heavy losses as he went. If he knew any of this, the Fuhrer chose to put it out of his mind. Celebrating the Japanese victory, even his closest generals believed would avail the Reich very little. They were more concerned with the Russian winter than with Japanese military action in the Pacific. Japan's action, all the generals agreed, promised no help to the armies on the Eastern Front. For them, rather, it evoked the specter of America's entry into the war on the side of an enemy who already was gaining the upper hand. On December 8th, before leaving for Berlin, in a ceremony honoring Japan's Ambassador Oshima for his country's success, Hitler sent word to Admiral Dönitz of the Kriegsmarine to have his U-boats begin attacking American ships wherever they found them. German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop knew that Hitler was preparing to declare war on the United States. Just minutes before an afternoon appointment with the Japanese ambassador, during which he knew Oshima would press for that declaration under the terms of the Axis Pact, Ribbentrop reminded the Fuhrer that Germany was not obliged to do so. Because Japan had attacked the United States, Germany was not bound by the accord to enter the war between the two nations. Hitler would hear none of it. "If we do not stand on the side of Japan," he told his minister, "the pact is politically dead." That was not Hitler's main reason for wanting war with the U.S. It had, he told Ribbentrop, already been a significant force in the war. What's more, Hitler knew, America's leaders believed it could not be ready to fight a major war until at least 1943. The time to strike was now. On December 11th, Hitler addressed the Reichstag, calling Roosevelt a criminal backed by millionaires and Jews who had provoked Japan into attacking the United States. Before Hitler could even say the words he had summoned them to hear, the members of the Reichstag rose and cheered him wildly. Back in the Wolf's Lair, the generals were astonished at the swift declaration. They knew that the Reich could not possibly widen the scope of its military commitment with any hope of success. Hermann Goering, commander of the Luftwaffe, was more direct. Privately, he called Hitler's headlong rush to war with the U.S. Selbstmord, suicide. As Japan's naval air forces were descending upon Pearl Harbor, about to deal the blow that would shake the United States forever from her isolationist mentality, the government of the United States was, with some exceptions, at lunch. Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was entertaining several dozen lunch guests in the Blue Room. The president would not be able to attend, she told her guests, because the news from Japan was very bad. The timing of the First Lady's comment was coincidental. She meant only that negotiations between the two nations were keeping the president too busy for socializing. No one in Washington had yet heard about the awful events in Hawaii. It was 1:30 p.m. when news of the attack first began to reach Washington. In a hallway near the office of Navy Secretary Frank Knox, an aide found Secretary Knox on his way to lunch and handed him a short message from Ford Island, Hawaii. Air raid, Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. Knox's first reaction was disbelief. This must be the Philippines. Another aide assured the secretary it was not. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover received the news by telephone from his Honolulu bureau chief, Robert L. Stivers. "I know Japanese planes when I see them," he told the director, then held the phone out the window so Hoover could hear the bombs dropping on Pearl. At the office of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, General Counsel Edward Ennis was writing contingency plans for dealing with aliens in the United States in the event of war. A staffer in the Honolulu immigration office called Ennis with the news just before 1:30. Ennis sat down and drafted an emergency proclamation for the president to sign. It authorized the FBI to question and search any of the 117,000 Americans with Japanese heritage living on the West Coast who might be suspected of being sympathetic to Japan. The emergency order would give the FBI the power to seize any contraband property belonging to these people. Everything from radios to cameras to books and magazines would be considered fair game. Before the president had even seen the order, let alone signed it, INS offices on the West Coast would be notified that they had summary power to apprehend any potentially dangerous Japanese aliens. It took Secretary Knox more than a quarter of an hour to reach President Roosevelt with the news. "Mr. President," Knox said, "it looks as if the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor." Roosevelt's first reaction was similar to Knox's. "No," was all he said before Knox hung up. To staff in his office, Roosevelt said, it was just the kind of unexpected thing the Japanese would do. At the time they were discussing peace in the Pacific, they were plotting to overthrow it. If this report is true, it would take matters entirely out of my hands. Then he picked up the phone. Just after 2 p.m. Washington, D.C. time, which was 8:30 a.m. Pearl time, the president called Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson at home to tell him, "They have attacked Hawaii. They are now bombing Hawaii." At 2:05 p.m., Roosevelt reached Secretary of State Cordell Hull at his office. Japan's ambassador, Kichisaburo Nomura, and Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu had just arrived at Hull's office. They were more than an hour late for a 1 p.m. appointment with Hull. Roosevelt told Hull about the attack on Pearl Harbor and instructed him to say nothing of it to the two Japanese diplomats. Hull was to receive the two, formally and coolly, hear what they had to say, and bow them out. On instructions from his government, Ambassador Nomura had called only that morning to make the appointment. Tokyo had sent him what amounted to a 14-part ultimatum to the United States government on its policy toward Japan, and ordered him to deliver it at precisely 1 p.m. Washington time, which was 7:30 a.m. in Hawaii. As it happened, it had taken much longer for the document to be prepared than either Tokyo or the Japanese embassy in Washington could have anticipated. By the time Nomura arrived at the State Department with the message in hand, the first wave was over, and official Washington already had heard the news. What's more, the U.S. State Department already had intercepted, decrypted, and read the contents of the message as they were being sent to Nomura. Secretary Hull's anger had been building for some time when he received the Japanese diplomats. He pretended to read the document they handed him and then asked Nomura, "Why 1 o'clock?" Hull knew, of course, what Nomura did not, that the original appointment time was half an hour before the bombing would begin. Nomura said, "I don't know the reason, but I was so instructed." Still pretending to read the document, Hull began shouting at the two Japanese. The message, he told them, was crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions on a scale so huge that I never imagined until today that any government on this planet was capable of uttering them. Then he ordered them out of his office. It took very little time for news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor to reach the American public.
I came from a small town in southwestern Minnesota, Springfield, population 2,049. The highlight event of the year was Sauerkraut Days, a 3-day festival that was put on by the American Legion, be a carnival in town, and the Chamber of Commerce and the city people would all pull together, and they would have free sauerkraut and wieners. Other than that, it's like a typical small town. You shoot a cannon down Main Street at 9 o'clock at night, and the only thing you'd hit would be a stray cat until Saturday night, and then all the farmers from around would come in and do their shopping. And it was a great time to be young. December 7th, 1941, I can remember it real clear. We'd gone to church in the morning and came home from church. It was a Sunday afternoon. And Sunday at 1 o'clock, Sammy Kaye's show came on, and that was popular with my folks. It was radio, no television, and it was always time out then. The family sat around and listened to Sammy Kaye, Swing and Sway with Sammy Kaye, and we were listening to the broadcast when the radio came on and said that Pearl Harbor had been bombed.
At 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, the Mutual Broadcasting System was announcing the news to its radio listeners. One of them angrily called the network switchboard in New York. He had heard and believed Mutual's 1938 broadcast of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds and wanted the network to know he wasn't about to be taken in a second time. At 2:31 p.m., CBS announcer John Daly interrupted regular programming with word of the bombing. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air, the president has just announced. The attack was also made on naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu. At Radio City Music Hall, crowds of moviegoers who had come to see Cary Grant and Joan Fontaine in suspicion got the news from the ticker-tape machine in the lobby. Some rushed home immediately. Others went on into the hall to watch the film. Back in Washington, a sellout crowd was on hand at Griffith Stadium, where slingin' Sammy Baugh was leading the Washington Redskins to victory over the Philadelphia Eagles. It was a Sunday, after all, and then, as now, Sunday afternoons were for football games. In the Griffith Stadium press box, Associated Press reporter Pat O'Brien received this message from his office by teletype. Japs just kicked off. War now. At the start of the second half, a reporter sitting in the stands got a telegram from his wife, addressed to Section P, top row, seat 27, opposite 25-yard line, east side Griffith Stadium. The note said simply, "War with Japan, get to office." After every play, announcements from the loudspeakers called generals and admirals in attendance, as well as the resident commissioner of the Philippines, to report to their offices at once. Yet Redskins owner George Preston Marshall and the stadium management refused to tell the crowd what had happened. Marshall said, "We never broadcast non-sports news at the stadium." A headline in the next morning's Washington Post would read, "War's outbreak is deep secret to 27,702 Redskin game fans." In Holyoke, Massachusetts, Major Curtis LeMay had just finished a day of training new members of his 34th Bomb Group on their two B-17 Flying Fortresses when he turned on the radio in his car to listen to the Giants game. Hearing the war bulletins, LeMay said he felt relief that the waiting was over. Charles Lindbergh heard the news of the Pearl Harbor bombing at his retreat on Martha's Vineyard. Lindbergh, a leading voice for American isolationism and a strident opponent of President Roosevelt's Lend-Lease arrangement to help Great Britain fight the Nazis, could not believe that Japan was capable of such a victory. His first thought was that the only possible reason for the success of the Japanese attack was that Roosevelt had sent so much of the U.S. Navy to the Atlantic. The president had left Hawaii defenseless in order to help Churchill, and the devastation at Pearl Harbor would surely convince America to stay out of the war. Just as the Japanese had done, Lindbergh badly misjudged the reaction of the American people. Within hours, all across the United States, Americans took to the streets, demonstrating their anger at the Japanese and their desire to go to war.
So I told my dad, I says, I'm probably going to get in the war when we get in, so I want to know something about it and be a little bit trained before we go into war. But little did I realize it would be right out there when it started.
The impact of it didn't hit me at that particular time until 5 days later my brother enlisted in the Air Force. And that's probably when it first started to hit home, you know, hey, this is serious. And the fellows from a little bit older than myself, you know, they were all leaving, going into the service.
On the West Coast, tensions ran high as the residents braced for a possible Japanese invasion. They began to regard their Japanese American and Nisei neighbors suspiciously. In San Pedro, California, and nearby Long Beach, the tuna fleet, which was mostly Japanese Americans, had set out to sea in the morning, then abruptly turned back to port when they heard the radio reports of the Pearl Harbor bombing. By 9 o'clock on the evening of December 7th, many of them were in the detention pen at Terminal Island, where more than 300 Japanese had been imprisoned after being taken from their homes and cars and boats. The next day, December 8th, at just after 12:30 in the afternoon, Eastern Time, Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, introduced President Roosevelt to a rare joint session of the House and the Senate. Wearing heavy metal leg braces, the president stood before a group of 339 congressmen and 82 senators and asked them to declare war on Japan.
The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and well understand the implications to the very life and safety of our nation. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
After Roosevelt's speech, the Senate voted unanimously for war. In the House, only one person, Representative Jeanette Rankin, voted no. Afterward, she said she did it because she did not want the world to think America was war crazy. The war for which Japan had been preparing for more than 80 years had come. And though there would be 4 years of struggle and millions of death before the conflict would be resolved, Japan already had lost. In the days and weeks after Pearl Harbor, all of Japan joined in the celebration of the Navy's great victory and of the coming, at long last, of war with the United States. The joy was tempered by the knowledge that no one in Japan could be sure of victory. But for the Japanese, victory was not finally the point. On the day after Emperor Hirohito's declaration of war was read to the nation, the writer Daigaku Horiguchi wrote, "The joy of fighting for the emperor and dying for him in battle is something a foreigner cannot understand, a joy that only we can experience." By 1945, a great many Japanese men, young and old, would experience that joy.